but there's a devourer that stands next to the God who is weighing your heart and judging your actions as you give your negative confession. And if you're found wanting, if you haven't lived according to Ma'at, the devourer takes you and you cease to live. Your soul is devoured. It's quite a consequence. What you can expect today and always on this podcast is that we will be talking about what it means for you and I to live a mission-driven life, how we can better understand and adhere to the 7 laws of life mission, and how they will show us the pathway to our unique work that God would have us do. Welcome back to the podcast. I am Audrey Rindlisbacher, the author of The Mission Driven Life and the founder of The Mission Driven Mom. I'm your host today. So excited that you're joining me. And I want to let you know, if you're new to this podcast, then you might want to consider keeping up with these current episodes, but also going back to the beginning. We actually reordered and reorganized the podcast somewhat so that you can begin at the beginning and binge all the way through, and you'll get a really nice sense of what we're about and what we do here as you learn to understand the 7 laws of life mission and how you can begin living them in your life, and how those laws and their principles will increase your confidence and put your house in order, help you find your gifts and talents, and put you on a path to having greater positive impact in your community for good. And that is our overarching objective here. You have a mission, you are unique and special. God has specific work for you to do, and we need you. We don't want to miss out. So we want to arm you with all the tools that you need to live a truly mission-driven life. You can also head over to themissiondrivenmom.com and grab your free copy of my book, The Mission Driven Life. We are giving you the audiobook to listen to for free. And that's where you'll learn how to discover and fulfill your unique contribution to the world and get busy learning and living those 7 laws of life mission. So make sure you go grab your free audiobook. You can also get the hard copy for just $16.99 over at themissiondrivenmom.com as well. If this podcast is benefiting your life, if it's blessing you in any way, we would really appreciate a review. That helps others know that we're doing a good job here in servicing you and those that listen in, and it helps us to increase our reach. I was recently interviewed on a couple of podcasts, and one was with Stephanie, the other with Cheryl. Stephanie Speaks and the Homeschool How-To podcast. I'm going to link below those podcast episodes where we talked about all things life mission. It was a joy to be on their shows, and you might want to give their shows a listen. Wanted to also give you a quick update on How Truth Makes Us Free, the book that I've been working on this year. It is coming along. I've got the first 5 chapters, which is part 1, in a pretty good place, and a good outline for the second half based on other commitments that we have through the fall. I'm hoping to release it this year. Fingers crossed. We'll be having a book cover made, which we'll get out to you so you can see what that will look like, and we'll also be offering pre-sales on the book. And just to help you understand better, this book is a companion to everything we do at The Mission Driven Mom, and it's a deep dive into some of the aspects of mission-driven living, especially what is truth, how is it connected to the natural moral law and true principles, how is it the framework of reality, and how does it make us free? The promise from Jesus that we can know the truth and the truth will make us free is very literal. We can search out true principles and apply them to our lives in ways that absolutely liberate us. And this book goes into the details of what truth is and how to understand it better, what the natural law framework looks like, and what it means to be truly set free, and the mechanism by which we know how to implement and apply those principles. I talked a little bit about that mechanism in our last podcast when we talked about the 2 consciences that battle within you, that devil on one side and angel on the other, that are trying to get your attention, and how we can begin ignoring the social conscience and nurturing the divine conscience, and how beautiful that process is, how it is the process by which we up-level our character and we hear God and his instructions and guidance better, and how we get on that path to being truth seekers in the most beautiful way. and living a truly mission-driven life, which of course is our objective here. What you can expect today and always on this podcast is that we will be talking about what it means for you and I to live a mission driven life, how we can better understand and adhere to the seven laws of life mission, and how they will show us the pathway to our unique work that God would have us do. With all of that said, I want to spend a few minutes with you today talking about something called Ma'at. If you know anything about ancient Egypt, you may have heard of this concept, and it's really quite fascinating. It is a key way in which we live a few of the principles of the seven laws of life mission. First of all, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, how we can be more willing. One of the principles of loving God, law one, is to have a willing heart and mind. And as we go through this concept of Ma'at, you will begin to see why that matters so much and how the ancient Egyptians were really living that principle. Also, living law two, loving ourselves and governing our hearts and minds, and law three, being truth seekers. So, a lot to that. Really good stuff. In ancient Egypt, there was a very robust religious tradition, and it was a big part of everything that Egyptian people did. And some of the fundamental beliefs that they had were that our life on earth is just a small section of a life that was before and will go on through eternity. They had such a strong belief in the afterlife. That's where mummification comes in and all of the Book of the Dead and the scrolls and all of that kind of stuff, the priests and the gods. And because they believed so intensely that we were here on earth as part of our eternal life and that our life would go on afterward, they lived differently while they were here, very differently. We're going to talk about how this concept of Ma'at was all encompassing for them and how it ties into everything we do at the Mission Driven Mom. So, the paradigm of the ancient Egyptian was that there were multiple gods. There were female and male gods that they had children and populated, and that these gods had different roles, different things that they did for human beings, and roles that they played here and after life, and that there was one supreme God. He was the God of all the gods. He sat on a throne, he was a king, and he was the supreme judge. They believed that there was this concept of Ma'at. And for those that have been around for very long at all, that have read The Mission Driven Life or been involved in the academy or events at the Mission Driven Mom, you will be familiar with the term the natural law. And that's the easiest way for me to help you understand what this Ma'at is. The supreme king in ancient Egypt was often called the Lord of Ma'at. And it was believed and taught, and Egyptians measured their goodness and what they called righteousness by the law of Ma'at and the Lord of Ma'at. And what they believed was that the supreme God was the supreme God because he always, all the time, complied with Ma'at. It's a concept of the good, the true, the beautiful, what is truly just and fair and right. And it is the knowledge that there is a right and there is a wrong, and that it is our first job to know the right and to do the right. And that the supreme God knew these laws and lived them perfectly. And he was the Lord of Ma'at, and that it was his relationship with Ma'at, his perfect adherence to Ma'at, that made him that supreme God. Okay, we have a society where people believe that they're going to live after this life. They believe that there's truly right and wrong, that there is a supreme God and other gods, and that this God is God because he lives according to eternal laws of right and wrong. The ancient Egyptians also believed that this law of right and wrong was incumbent upon them, and that their job on earth was to follow God, to follow his lead and his example, and to please him by living the law of Ma'at. And that what was going, and the most fascinating part of all of this to me is, I don't know, it's all fascinating, but the culmination of all of this was that for the ancient Egyptian, after death, they would be brought before God and judged. And they would be judged according to Ma'at. It was the tenets of right and wrong found in the Ma'at, which we would call the natural law, that they were required to live according to. And I'm going to share with you what they did to demonstrate that we know, and it goes all the way back. There's the old, and the middle, and the new kingdom. It goes all the way back to the old kingdom, almost to the very beginning of ancient Egyptian society, which lasted for almost 3,000 years. And it was the what we're going to talk about today in conjunction with the Ma'at happened all throughout those thousands of years. They were going to meet God and they were going to be judged. And what was going to happen was their heart was going to be weighed against a feather. And you can see this. I'll put up some pictures for those that see this on YouTube of what this looked like in these ancient Egyptian inscriptions and scrolls. And just as a side note, what I think is so fascinating is that the Ma'at was a feather because in being good and doing the right, your heart remained light, light as a feather. That it was sin and evil doing that weighed it down. And that's why the heart could be measured against the feather, because if you lived according to the law of Ma'at, then your heart would be light, your burdens would be light and lifted, and you would come out in the scale as not being heavier than the law itself. The living of the law made your heart weigh the same as the law. So fascinating. And especially if you head over to, even in the Quran, but definitely in the Bible and other world religions, you will find this same kind of idea that you should have a soft heart, that you would have a light heart, that righteousness and goodness would make your life more peaceful, easier, better. And this is the same imagery and symbolism that we're getting from these ancient Egyptians. Because they truly believed that this judgment was going to happen, that their heart was going to be weighed, and that they were going to be judged, they wanted to be optimally prepared for this moment. Because if they could pass this judgment, now in some periods during the Egyptian civilization, there were other doors you had to make it through, other names you had to know. And so some of these books of the dead, some of these scrolls that were written that were included in people's tombs, were to give them other things that they would need in the afterlife to pass through these gates and to pass by these people, these gatekeepers. And then they believed that when they passed all of these and they passed their final judgment, that they would go to the afterlife. And the afterlife, ironically, would look a lot like this life, except that they would be among the gods and they would be with their loved ones, doing many of the same things that they had done in this life. And that there was maximum happiness there and joy and goodness. So, what ended up developing really early on in ancient Egyptian civilization was that people who could afford it at all would ask the priests to help them, or if they were literate themselves, they could work on it. Some kind of scroll that they could have with them, with their body, that would help them in the afterlife, that would give them these names and help them walk through and pass their judgment. And a big part of what this was became known as negative confessions. And we have a ton of these because they're written in tombs, they're written on the inside of coffins when there were coffins, and then later when they became the shape of the body, when they were mummified, then they were put on scrolls and put in the scroll with the body. The scroll was put in with the body. And these negative confessions were the things that the person would say when they were facing the great God being judged. And we learn so much about ancient Egypt by reading these negative confessions, because it is a list of things that the person didn't do to prove to God that they lived the Ma'at, because the Ma'at prohibited certain behaviors. And so they want to prove that they didn't do those things. But They have to be 100% truthful because they're standing in front of God and He will know if they are lying. So, whatever they confess in their negative confession has to be absolutely true. And there's some really fascinating ramifications of this for the individual, their family, and the society, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And as they give these negative confessions, they have to be 100% truthful, have to be able to say these things with complete confidence to God that these are things I didn't do. So I lived according to the Ma'at, and weighing my heart and my confession will prove to you that I deserve to basically go to heaven, to go up and be with the gods. So I want to read you a few of these negative confessions because what you're going to find when I read them is that they align with your idea of what is right and what is wrong. Because this is universal and eternal. I talk about it in chapter 2 of the Mission Driven Life. Just briefly, I will talk about it in more depth in the Mission in How Truth Makes You Free book. I have a recent podcast called What is Truth, where you can get a deeper dive into all of this. You can even head over to audreyrillisbacher.com and get Truth Seeker Starter Kit, which has a recording of a natural law deep dive that I gave at one of our MDM celebration events. So there's a lot of information that I've developed to help you better understand it. It's not my idea. It's very ancient. It's very old. In the West, we call it the natural law, the moral law, the law of human nature. In ancient Egypt, it's called the Ma'at. In Hindu, it's called the Rita. In Chinese, it's called the Tao. So it has a myriad of names in different cultures at different times and places, but it is the moral framework by which men and women can live in the very best way possible. It's the way that C.S. Lewis said it is my very favorite way, that it's the instruction manual for human beings. God created us and he put the natural law in the fabric of our being. It's written in our very hearts, and we can know what's right and wrong by listening to that mechanism of conscience, by the divine conscience, and we can nurture and educate the divine conscience and all these things. So beautiful. And it can guide and govern our lives. And it was so well understood, so prolific in ancient Egyptian society. I really do think that we can credit a lot of the survival of that civilization over so many centuries to the fact that this was present and that it was the way in which a person needed to live. Now, there's a lot more to that. Obviously, they had slaves, they enslaved the Israelites, there was corruption, they weren't a perfect people. But just by virtue of the fact that we know that they knew the natural law, that they believed that they would be held accountable for their behavior, if not in this life, definitely in the afterlife, and that they would have to confess the things that they had done that they did. This is another thing I love about the negative confession. It proves that they didn't think they had to be perfect, but they had to live the best they could according to as many of the principles of Ma'at as possible. And that would have made them a certain kind of people. So here's some of the confessions, and we have a ton of them. This is from, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name. It's from a tomb. It's on the right side of the facade. It says, I have gone from my town. I have descended from my nome, having done justice for its Lord, having contented him with what he loves. I spoke the good. I repeated the good. I grasped the right manner, for I wanted the good for people. I judged two parties so as to content them. I saved the weak from one stronger than he as best I could. I spoke truly. I acted justly. I gave bread to the hungry, clothes to the naked. I landed one who was stranded. I buried him who lacked a son. I made a boat for the boatless and supported the orphan. I never spoke evil against anyone to a potentate. Now, if some bells aren't going off in your mind, then I don't know. Because clearly we hear Jesus's words in this confession from ancient Egypt. Matthew 25. Then the king say unto him on his right hand, Come, ye blessed of my father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was in hunger, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came unto me. Then he shall answer, saying, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you did it unto the one of the least of these, you did it unto me, and you shall go away. And those that did not do this will go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. So these same ideas that Jesus is teaching are present in ancient Egypt, that we should care for those who are weak, that we should feed the hungry, we should clothe the naked, we should support the orphan. We should stand up for those who don't have as much as us. And that is what being righteous is. And that's what earns eternal life. It's so incredibly cool. And we can read, there's a really great resource that I stumbled upon that has a whole bunch of these collected, and then the author goes through them and demonstrates some of the highest values of ancient Egypt based upon what is on all of these negative confessions, what the people say they're proud of that they did. Okay, there's a whole bunch of these that I could read to you, but I'm not going to go through a ton of them. I'll link the resource that I found that will give you a whole bunch of them if you want to read them. But I've got my Book of the Dead. And I want to be clear that there isn't necessarily just one specific Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead has come to be known as the Book of the Dead because it is a scroll. I think they said it was 77 feet long. It's by a priest named Ani that was very elaborate that he had written out for him so he would just be optimally prepared. And that's what kind of usually gets published as the Book of the Dead is his particular scroll. And I want to read you his negative confession because it goes through a whole bunch of these ancient Egyptian values and their idea of what is right and wrong. I have not done iniquity. I have not robbed with violence. I have done no murder. I have done no harm. I have not defrauded offerings. I have not minished oblations. I have not plundered the God. I have spoken no lies. I have not snatched away food. I have not caused pain. I have not committed fornication. So they also had strict sexual codes, and not committing fornication was an important thing to say to the gods about your behavior that aligns with Ma'at. I have not caused shedding of tears, and that would mean like intentionally, hasn't intentionally caused others pain. I have not dealt deceitfully. I have not transgressed. I have not acted guilefully. I have not laid waste the plowed land. I have not been an eavesdropper. I have not set my lips in motion against any man. I have not been angry and wrathful except for a just cause. I have not defiled the wife of any man. I have not polluted myself. I have not caused terror. I have not transgressed. I have not burned with rage. I have not stopped my ears against the words of right and truth. I love that one because the not stealing, not plundering, not engaging in wrong sexual behaviors or otherwise is predominant, but also that he didn't turn down good counsel. He didn't plug his ears or turn away when right and truth were being spoken. He was open to that. He tried to be humble and teachable. I have not worked grief. I have not stirred up strife. I have not judged hastily. I have not been an eavesdropper. I have not multiplied words exceedingly. I have done neither harm nor ill. I have never cursed the king. I have never fouled the water. I have not spoken scornfully. I have never cursed God. I have not stolen. I have not defrauded the offerings of the gods. I have not plundered the offerings to the blessed dead. I have not filched the food of the infant, neither have I sinned against the God of my native town. I have not slaughtered with evil intent the cattle of the God. And he goes on, he has these beautiful prayers. I wanted to read you this little section of one of them. Thoth, the righteous judge, so Thoth is one of the gods, the righteous judge of the great company of the gods who are in the presence of the god Osiris, saith, Hear ye this judgment. The heart of Osiris hath in very truth been weighed, and his soul hath stood as a witness for him. It hath been found true by ritual in the great balance. There hath not been found any wickedness in him. He hath not wasted the offerings in the temple. He hath not done harm by his deeds, and he uttered no evil reports while he was upon earth. So that's what Ani hopes to have said about him at his final judgment, that he is accepted, that he is deemed righteous, and that he passes this final judgment. In one of these resources that I found, one of the things that she proves through this segment is that the gods were subject to the law of Ma'at and that they also lived according to it. She says, another passage tells that the four sons of Horus live by Ma'at. But the king does not, he merely aspires to it. So there was this understanding that there was a division between God and men. And the key division between God and men was that men were just trying to live according to Ma'at. The gods embodied Ma'at. And so the king was trying to live according to Ma'at and be like the gods. But the real eternal gods lived Ma'at perfectly. Pepi is one of these four gods. Imseti, Hapi, Dammutef, and Keben Senhuf, who live by Ma'at, who lean on their stats, who watch over Upper Egypt. So that's the quote from this ancient document. And it goes on, for perspectives on Ma'at, thinking outside of biographical sources, we now turn to the instruction of Ptahhotep. And here's a quote from, this is Maxim number 5. Great is Ma'at, lasting in effect, undisturbed since the time of Osiris. For one punishes the breaker of laws, though the greedy one overlooks this. In the end, it is Ma'at that lasts. Man says, it is my father's ground. While baseness may seize riches, crime never lands its wares. And then it goes on to say, these verses convey that Ma'at was viewed as a primordial condition, one firmly founded and lasting, which when activated overcomes all crime. Maxim number 19 elaborates, quote, that man endures whose rule is Ma'at, who walks a straight line, he will make a will by it. One who is greedy has no tomb. There's also this element of the final judgment. And I'll link a couple pictures in the YouTube video, you can see it. But there's a devourer that stands next to the God who is weighing your heart and judging your actions as you give your negative confession. And if you're found wanting, if you haven't lived according to Ma'at, the devourer takes you and you cease to live. Your soul is devoured. It's quite a consequence. So here's some of my takeaways from this whole understanding of what the ancient Egyptians believed and what Ma'at is. And the more you understand about the natural law, and if you listen to my previous podcast on what is truth, you will really be able to connect those dots and see that Ma'at is just the natural law. And it's in force in ancient Egypt. And I had some takeaways I wanted to share with you from all of this information. By making a list of all the things that they had not done that were part of the natural law or the law of Ma'at, they would not have to say anything to God that was a lie. And they could stand with confidence about all the ways in which they hadn't done bad things. This would shed them in the best light, but it would also create a frame of reference during their lifetime where they were focused on the good things about themselves, but they also didn't expect themselves to be perfect. But they were striving to live according to this Ma'at all the time because the final judgment was imminent and they didn't know when they were going to die. And they were going to need to be able to say that they had done all of these things. It would also mean that if they knew they were going to stand before God and they knew they needed to be able to say that there were key elements of the natural law that they hadn't broken, then it would create a lot of self-discipline in life. Think about that. You just know that this is coming and you know that you're going to answer to God. You're going to stand before him and have your heart weighed. And so you'd better get your act together and exercise some discipline right now and be able to put some things on the list that you definitely did not do. Because they knew that they would need to make a pretty impressive confession, they would exercise that self-discipline on a pretty large scale. And because they did that, and they would want to be able to say to God that there were certain wrong things they had never done, there would be a lot of personal restraint, which would hugely benefit society. Because you would have all of these leaders. And again, the evidences that we have on all these tombs, these are people who could afford to write a negative confession and leave it behind, that either had enough money to hire a priest or somebody that was literate or were literate themselves. And so you've got even people in leadership positions that are affecting the culture and the social conscience are people who are going to be accountable for their choices and therefore feel like they have to live a certain way because they're going to be held accountable. So you would have these leaders who were in positions of influence, but they're constantly taking care of the orphans and the poor and not murdering and not committing adultery and not stealing and not robbing from the orphan and all of these points that came up in the negative confessions, which would make for a way more stable, elevated, and virtuous society. One of the quotes from something else that I read said that the soul is rewarded for living a good and virtuous life. That's a fundamental paradigm of the whole Egyptian civilization, and one I think that isn't brought up enough. They were humans, they did bad stuff, things happened. But the fact that this religion had such a stronghold in their culture that these men and women felt compelled to govern themselves better, to discipline themselves in their everyday behavior so that they could literally go and answer to God about it is so cool. Undeniable evidence of the universality of the natural law, but also just a cool example for us and a recognition that is what we need to be doing if we want to have a healthier social conscience and if we want to thrive as individuals. It's one of the fundamental elements of actually living a mission-driven life and being a truth seeker is to understand that we can not break the law, but we can only break ourselves against the law, and that Ma'at and the Tao and the Raita and the natural law are always in force. And if life isn't going the way that we want it to, and there's persistent problems we don't know how to solve, it may very well be that there are principles of the natural law we don't know and we aren't living. We've gotten out of the habit or belief that even asking ourselves what God would think of our behavior has is causing a lot of damage in our culture. Because if we were asking ourselves that question, then we would probably rein in the drinking, rein in the sexual exploits, rein in the pleasurable activities, and start thinking more about what are we doing that we can go tell God about, that He would be proud of us for, that would demonstrate that we were trying to live like Him, that we were trying to honor His law. Of course, like any ritual, it could become trivialized or ridiculous, but the consistency of this mindset definitely for sure helped the culture, and its persistence all through that 3,000 years kept a solid foundation of good and evil, of right and wrong, embedded, deeply entrenched in the culture. It also is really awesome. This was one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading Negative Confessions was that these the confessions that I'm reading are by people who were better off in this culture, and they're kneeling before gods and they're offering oblations and they're giving up. A lot of the things that they'll say is, I gave my best ox or my best whatever when I made sacrifice or whatever the case was. And it just shows a level of humility because they aren't the law. They're not a law unto themselves. They don't get to make up the law. They're accountable to something else, to someone else. And keeping that level of humility in, especially in the leadership, could have only been a good thing. One last thing, one last takeaway, and I've mentioned this before. I hope it isn't annoying that I bring it up sometimes, but I really want to do battle with the culture. There are so many things in our culture that need correction and that are unhealthy and that are just flat out lies. And one of the lies that our culture is telling us is that people anciently only believed in God because they were afraid of natural disasters and they didn't want the next hurricane to take them away. And they didn't know where rain and storms came from and they had to do the rain dances. And it paints ancient people as really ignorant, really backward, really stupid, that religion was just something they came up with because they didn't know better. But when you actually go back and read and educate yourself on what was said and what was done, what you find is highly sophisticated people in what they think about and the way that they problem solve and the things that they're doing. Take ancient Egypt, for example. The stuff they left behind that they did without modern technology is unbelievable. But the bigger lesson for us is that this religion wasn't something that they did to manage natural disasters or other issues like that. It was something that was about their moral framework. And the Ma'at is just a perfect example of that. We know without a doubt that religion was being driven by Ma'at, by the natural law. People understood that the foundation of life, foundation of living a good human life, was understanding the right and the wrong and living according to it and preparing yourself for eventual judgment before God. And what that meant was it was influencing religion was something that religion was an outgrowth of this moral law that they were trying to live. It was influencing their daily lives. It was tempering their behavior all the time. It was demonstrating a relationship between men and the gods. Man was not afraid of God crouching in a corner and hoping that he would stop the hurricanes. He was submitting to God's higher law, trying to please him with his behavior. And he loved and respected and honored God as God and worshiped him and wanted to show his respect and honor in his behavior, not in human sacrifice, not in going through the motions. This was a religion that was an everyday experience. It was something that you were expected to get up in the morning and think about, I've got to live a certain way to please God and make sure that my eternal life is what I want it to be. It was a very forward thinking way of living, and it was all wrapped up in a perception of how humans ought to live, not fear of the elements. I just want to make that clear because it's just a big fat lie whenever you hear it. Now, our takeaways as we finish up today. One of the most common negative confessions was that they never doubted the natural law or the existence of God. And that they always knew that he was real, that his law was real, and that they had an obligation to try and live according to Ma'at. And this really shows that willingness principle that is part of loving God. That they would admit that God was God, that he was in charge, that it was his rules, not theirs, that men and women had to obey, and that by doing this, they could please him and they could be the best people possible. And that the best people in their culture were the people that best followed the Ma'at. And this is a hugely important lesson for you and I, because you could go back and listen to my Charlotte Mason podcast where I explained some of the things from the first in her home education series. She's amazing. And what she does is what I want to do, what we're all about at the Mission Driven Mom, and that is helping people understand how truth can make them free and how they can live according to that truth and discover and fulfill their life missions. And what she explains is that parents do their children a huge disservice when they act like people who are pious and who go to church are somehow always, for sure, no matter what, living more of God's laws than people that don't do that, or that do that less frequently, or that even people that say that they don't believe in God, because it's all about obedience to God's laws. She says you can go outside and you can feel the warmth of the sun and still deny that it exists. People can live according to God's laws and deny that they come from God, but his laws are always accompanied by blessings. And so our willingness, our humility, our teachability is always going to be the linchpin of whether or not we get the blessings that we're seeking, whether or not we solve the problems that persist in our lives, because the answers are out there. We can find the truth and it can make us free. It's just our hearts. Which is so cool because it goes back to the Egyptian heart. That heart is a willing heart, a teachable heart. Another principle that it really exemplifies is Law 3, loving truth. These people were interested in understanding the virtues, the core principles, so that they could live according to them in their everyday lives. They were present. It was clear. prolific all throughout their negative confessions, that there was no question what was right and what was wrong, and it was very consistent. And of course, it matches our ideas of right and wrong today. Now, some of which, like not engaging in fornication, etc., we don't have that same frame of reference anymore. I talked about this in the last podcast because our social conscience has been distorted. But that's what you and I can correct. And maybe one of you that's listening has a mission to help correct that. And that would be wonderful to watch that unfold. One last thing, like I said at the beginning, Law 2, loving yourself. One last thing, like I mentioned at the beginning, Law 2, in loving yourself. You can't really love yourself unless you're striving for self-mastery. And part of striving for self-mastery is to govern your heart and your mind. Knowing that God is God, that He loves you, that He has gifts for you, that He wants you to uncover those and use them in His service, and that He expects you to align your heart and mind with His laws and His will, and that is how you partner with Him to do things that will have immense positive impact. If you haven't listened to very many of the mission driven stories on this podcast, I would highly encourage you to go back and listen to those and begin to see the common threads that these mission driven men and women had. Humility was a huge one, seeking truth, disciplining themselves, live according to conscience. And the story of the history and the history of ancient Egypt is aligned with all of that, which means that they would have been happier as their lives aligned with the true natural law. So I want to end by reminding you that you are unique and you are gifted, that God has special missions just for you, and that you ought to get busy discovering and fulfilling your missions. And as you do that, you will watch as you begin to blossom, as your family is strengthened, and your community is blessed. Thanks for joining me. I will see you next time.